Imagine you are walking through a city. The year is 1347. Somewhere in southern Europe, the streets are quiet, too quiet for a city this size. And then you see it, a figure, coming toward you through the fog. Tall, black coat down to the ground, wide-brimmed hat, and a face, not a face, a mask, with a long curved beak, like a crow, like something that belongs in a nightmare. In each hand, a wooden rod, so it never has to touch you. It doesn't speak, it doesn't need to. You already know what it means. Someone on your street is dying, and this thing, this creature in black, is the closest thing to a doctor they will ever see. The plague doctor. For 2 centuries, they walked into the worst pandemic in human history, armed with a beak full of herbs, a coat covered in wax, and absolutely no idea what was actually killing everyone. Today, we find out what it was really like to be one of them, and why the mask they became famous for was completely useless. To understand the plague doctor, you first need to understand what they were walking into. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347. It came by ship from the Crimean coast, carried by merchants who were already dying when they docked at Messina in Sicily. The harbor master ordered the ships back out to sea. It was too late. What followed was the single greatest demographic catastrophe in recorded human history. In 4 years, between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people worldwide. In Europe alone, it killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population. Let that number settle for a moment. 1 in every 2 people you knew, dead. In 4 years, some cities lost 60% of their population. In certain regions of Italy and France, entire villages simply ceased to exist. There was nobody left to bury the dead. Bodies piled in the streets, in the churches, in the fields. The living, wrote one survivor, did not trouble themselves with the dead. People had no framework for what was happening. Nothing in human experience had prepared them for this scale of death. They prayed. They flagellated themselves in public. They blamed the Jews and massacred them across Europe. They blamed the planets. They blamed bad air. They blamed God. None of it stopped the dying. And into this walked the plague doctors. Not heroes. Not volunteers. In most cases, men who had absolutely no choice. Here is the first thing popular culture gets wrong about plague doctors. They were not the best doctors of their age, bravely volunteering to help the sick. They were almost universally the worst. When plague arrived in a city, the first thing that happened was that every qualified, experienced physician left. Immediately. They had the money to leave, the connections to leave, the horses to leave, and they knew better than anyone what was coming. What cities were left with were the doctors who couldn't leave. Young doctors just starting out. Doctors with debts. Doctors whose reputations were already damaged. And sometimes not doctors at all. Cities desperate for anyone to treat the sick hired barbers, surgeons, and men with no medical training whatsoever. The bar was simply being willing to go into the plague houses. That willingness was the entire qualification. These were the men who became plague doctors. Contracted by city governments, sometimes for enormous sums, because the price of a man's life goes up when his life is genuinely at risk. To do the work the real physicians had abandoned. Their contracts were remarkable documents. Cities promised plague doctors salaries, housing, and in some cases, the right to perform autopsies on plague victims, which was usually forbidden by the church. In return, plague doctors were required to stay in the city. They were forbidden to leave. Some tried. Cities that caught fleeing plague doctors fined them, imprisoned them, or in extreme cases, executed them. Plague doc. You signed the contract, you stayed, and you put on the costume. The plague doctor costume is one of the most recognizable images in all of history. That long black coat, the wide-brimmed hat, the gloves, and above all, the beak. Let's talk about the beak. The costume as most people picture it, including the iconic beak mask, was actually designed relatively late. The version we know was formalized by a French physician named Charles Delorme around 1619. By that point, the worst of the Black Death was over, but plague kept returning in waves for centuries. The design was based on a specific theory about how disease spread. Medieval medicine operated on the concept of miasma, bad air, the idea that disease was carried in foul-smelling air, particularly the air around rotting bodies and sick people. This theory was completely wrong, but it was logical. Plague did cluster around death and decay. The correlation seemed obvious. The beak mask was designed to combat miasma. The long beak, sometimes half a meter long, was stuffed with aromatic herbs and flowers, lavender, mint, camphor, roses. The idea was that breathing through this filter would protect the doctor from the bad air. It didn't work. Here is the dark irony. Plague is spread by fleas, specifically, fleas carried by rats. When a plague doctor walked into a plague house wearing his long waxed coat, sealed theoretically against bad air, he was actually creating an environment that fleas could not easily penetrate, not because of the herbs, because of the wax. The long coat, the gloves, the covered skin, by accident for entirely the wrong reasons. The costume provided some genuine protection against flea bites, not complete protection. Many plague doctors died, but the waxed coat worked better than nothing, while the beak full of lavender did absolutely nothing. They survived despite the mask, not because of it. The wooden rods they carried were for examining patients without touching them, or for directing patients, pointing them to specific rooms, specific positions without physical contact. Again, completely sensible behavior for entirely the wrong reason. They thought they were avoiding bad air. They were actually reducing flea exposure. Medieval accident, modern science. The costume that became a symbol of death was, in its confused and accidental way, the first personal protective equipment in the history of medicine. So what did plague doctors actually do for their patients? The honest answer is, almost nothing useful. Medieval medicine had three main tools: bleeding, purging, and prayer. Bleeding, removing blood from the patient through cuts or leeches, was applied to almost every condition. The theory was that illness resulted from an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Remove the excess, restore the balance. For plague patients, bleeding was catastrophic. A person dying of bubonic plague is already in shock, already dehydrated, already running out of blood pressure. Removing blood, sometimes large quantities, accelerated their death dramatically. Plague doctors who bled their patients were, with the best intentions and the full weight of medical authority behind them, killing people faster. Purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea through herbal preparations, was similarly useless and similarly weakening. The buboes, the swollen blackened lymph nodes that gave the Black Death its name, were sometimes lanced. This was the one procedure that occasionally helped, not because of the theory behind it, but because draining an infected abscess can reduce bacterial load. Accidentally effective. Some plague doctors prescribed posies, small bouquets of aromatic flowers to hold under the nose. This is the origin of the nursery rhyme "Ring Around the Rosy." The rosy rash, the posy sneezing, the falling down, a children's song about mass death. Mostly plague doctors did what they could, which was record, keep track of who had died, where, how quickly, report to city authorities, help with the logistics of quarantine. Their real value was not medical, it was administrative and psychological. The presence of someone in authority, doing something, anything, provided a degree of comfort in the middle of absolute horror. That is not nothing, but it is not medicine. What was it actually like to be a plague doctor day by day? The records that survive, diaries, city contracts, occasional letters, paint a picture that is almost unbearable to read. What weeks mourning knowing that the people you had visited the day before were probably dead. You dressed in your costume, a process that took time, that was itself a ritual of preparation for what you were about to see. You walked through streets that smelled of death in summer heat. You knocked on doors, and people let you in, because you were the only help available. The houses of plague victims were something that no modern person has ever experienced. The smell alone, a combination of infection, fever, sweat, and decomposition, was documented by survivors as the most overwhelming sensory experience of their lives. Inside, you might find an entire family sick, some already dead, children lying next to parents, the healthy trying to care for the dying, becoming sick themselves. You did what you could. You recorded names. You checked buboes, those horrible swollen lumps in the armpit, the groin, the neck. You bled people, purged them, prayed with them, and then you moved to the next house. Some plague doctors visited 20, 30, 40 houses in a single day. At night, you returned to wherever you were staying, often isolated from the rest of the population, sometimes literally locked in a house by the city to prevent you from spreading the disease further. You ate alone, you slept alone, and you tried not to think too hard about the fact that the men who had held your job before you were in many cases also dead. The mortality rate among plague doctors varied. In the worst outbreaks, it was extremely high. In others, the waxed costume provided enough protection to survive. But every day you put on that beak, you were making a bet on your own life, with odds you had no way of calculating. Here is something that gets lost in the horror of the plague years. The plague doctors, for all their wrong theories and useless treatments, made real contributions to medicine, not intentionally, not through correct understanding, but through sheer accumulation of observation. They were the first physicians to systematically document an epidemic in real time. They recorded symptoms, progression, death rates, geographic spread, city by city, outbreak by outbreak. This data accumulated. It took centuries to understand what it meant. But when germ theory finally emerged in the 19th century, the plague records were invaluable. Plague doctors also, accidentally, pioneered quarantine. The concept of isolating the sick from the healthy was not invented during the Black Death. It existed in biblical tradition, but plague doctors were the first to apply it systematically, at city scale, backed by legal authority. 40 days of isolation. That is where the word quarantine comes from. Quarantina. 40. They got the mechanism completely wrong. They thought they were containing bad air, not contagion. But the effect was real. Cities that quarantined aggressively had lower death rates than cities that didn't. Right outcome. Wrong reason. This is actually how a lot of medicine worked until the 20th century. Doing the right thing for the completely wrong reason, and surviving long enough to eventually figure out why it worked. The plague doctor is not a hero, but he is something interesting. He is a man standing at the absolute edge of human knowledge, doing the best he can with what he has, in conditions that would break most people. That's not heroism, but it is something. The Black Death ended, not because anyone stopped it, but because it ran out of hosts. The survivors were, in many cases, genetically resistant. Europe rebuilt itself, slowly over generations, but the plague doctor never really left. The image, the beak, the hat, the black coat became one of the most persistent symbols in Western culture. It appears in Venetian carnival tradition, where the costume became a theatrical character. It appears in art, in literature, in modern horror. Why? Why does this particular image endure, when so much of the medieval world has faded? I think it's because the plague doctor represents something that never goes away. The figure that walks toward the thing everyone else is running from. That shows up, equipped with insufficient tools and incorrect theories, and does the job anyway. Not out of heroism, out of obligation, out of contract, out of the simple fact that someone has to. We've seen that figure again, in every epidemic since, in every hospital, in every crisis. The tools get better, the theories get more accurate, the understanding improves, but the fundamental situation, one person standing between the sick and the void, with whatever they have, that never changes. The beak mask is in museums now, behind glass. An artifact of a world that no longer exists, but the person who wore it is still out there. Different costume, different disease, same contract. Someone has to go in. So, the plague doctor, not a hero, not a monster, something more complicated than either. A person, usually young, usually desperate, usually the last resort, who put on a costume based on a completely wrong theory, walked into houses full of dying people, administered treatments that mostly made things worse, and somehow accidentally helped build the foundations of modern epidemiology. History remembers the beak mask, the sinister silhouette, the figure of death walking through empty streets. But behind that mask was a human being, with a contract they couldn't escape, with hands that touched more death in a week than most people see in a lifetime, with nights alone in isolated rooms, listening to a city die outside the window. That person deserves to be remembered as more than a symbol. Next in this series, the Salem Witch Trials, 1692, 19 people hanged, 1 pressed to death with stones, and a community that destroyed itself from the inside out. The real story is nothing like the history books. And the real reason it happened is more disturbing than witchcraft. That video is already up. Before you go, tell me in the comments, if you had been a plague doctor, would you have stayed or found a way out? I'm genuinely curious. This is Dark Chronicles. History isn't what they taught you.